Welcome everyone. We appreciate you taking a little bit of time out of your days to join us for our webinar here at Wilderness Watch. This is our first webinar. I suspect there will be many more to follow. We'll have to see how it goes. I'm George Nickus, Executive Director of Wilderness Watch, and I'll be the moderator for today's discussion. We're going to be talking about a very special place, the Izembek National Wildlife Refuge and Wilderness, and the extraordinary threat it faces from a decades-long boondoggle of a plan to build a road through the refuge and wilderness and some of its richest wildlife habitat to connect two small communities of King Cove and Cold Bay, one of which has one of Alaska's longest aircraft landing strips, and the other, one of its largest canneries, angling to ship its fresh seafood more quickly to markets around the globe. Joining me in the presentation today will be Dana Johnson, Wilderness Watch's staff attorney, and Fran Mauer, a career wildlife biologist with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and Wilderness Watch's chapter representative in Alaska. Working behind the scenes to make sure that this all runs smoothly is our communications director, Dawn Sarah. So thank you, Dawn. And if it doesn't work, we can blame Dawn and leave the rest of us off the hook. Fran will tell us a little bit about this special place and its incredible value to wildlife and the wilderness system, and take us through some of the history of the proposals to build a road. Dana will pick up where Fran leaves off, describing the last decade of legislative and administrative efforts to circumvent environmental laws to allow the road to be built, and how our litigation efforts have thwarted those plans thus far. Our program will run for about 25 or 30 minutes. Following that, we'll be taking questions from all of you. So if you have a question, just click on the Q&A button, which should be along the bottom of your screen somewhere, and type away. And then we'll start answering those questions after the presentations. Since so few of us have actually witnessed firsthand the beauty and richness that is Izembek, we wanted to begin our program with a short video clip that the Cornell Lab of Ornithology has generously shared with us. It'll give you a glimpse into why the fight to protect Izembek is so critical. Toward the end of the webinar, we'll share a link where you can watch the entire video, which I strongly recommend you do. You'll be glad you did. In preparing for the program, we found that for some folks, either because of your internet connections or whatever, the film clip is not of the highest quality. But trust me, if you go to the YouTube site that we'll provide, you'll get it in its highest quality. You'll get the idea. And when you watch the full version, you'll have a good, clear watch. With that, Don, let's roll the film clip, and then we'll hear from Fran. Thanks.
Izembek. It's a national wildlife refuge in western Alaska that few people even know exists. Over 2/3 of its area is designated wilderness, the highest level of federal land protection in the United States. For years, I had been hearing about pressure to build a road through the Izembek Wilderness to connect two communities, and I learned that a survey had been conducted to mark the proposed route. Little visual documentation exists of Izembek, so I came here to photograph and discover for myself what inspired the protection of this little-known place. Stepping foot into a wilderness is a humbling experience, especially when the best way to travel is to follow an ancient network of trails that generations of brown bears have carved into the tundra. It's late summer, and except for the constant wind, the landscape is relatively quiet. The masses of migratory waterfowl that come to Izembek's coastal lagoons haven't arrived yet. But a little further inland, I found another migration heating up. Hundreds of thousands of salmon, chum, silver, pink, and sockeye, pouring into Izembek streams and rivers to spawn. And where there are salmon, there are bears. Lots of them. Bears of all ages congregate here to hunt for easy prey in the shallow riffles and pools. It's a critical time of the year for putting on fat before winter sets in. Mother bears with cubs in tow navigate around much larger and potentially dangerous adult males that are here too. But there is plenty of food when the fish arrive, and enough space for an abundance of bears and other wildlife to coexist and thrive. Izembek lies at the end of the Alaska Peninsula. At 310,000 acres, it's the state's smallest wildlife refuge. But it protects a unique convergence of land and water that is extremely productive for wildlife. Rivers and streams descend from the highlands, providing habitat for spawning salmon that attracts some of the highest densities of brown bears in Alaska. Two brackish coastal lagoons, Izembek and Kinzerov, offer rich marine environments for a diversity of waterfowl, shorebirds, and marine mammals. In between the lagoons, a narrow, low-lying isthmus of tundra and wetlands serves as a vital corridor for the seasonal movements of bears, wolves, and caribou, and habitat where migratory birds nest and feed.
Yes, I'd like to begin where this clip leaves off, and that is at the Izembek Lagoon, which is one of the world's largest eelgrass beds and had been designated a wetland of international significance under the Ramsar Convention. It was the first one that the US identified in this international wetlands program. And as you could see on the map that was shown already, Izembek lies out at the tip of the Alaska Peninsula. The Alaska Peninsula is about 400 miles long, and so it's right out at the end. And right at the end of that peninsula is this enormous world-class eelgrass bed that is a fueling station for all kinds of migratory waterfowl, and especially the Pacific brant, which is a sea goose that nests in Western Alaska and up on the North Slope and on into Canada, but it also nests over in Russia. And nearly the entire world population of black brant, or of Pacific brant, ultimately come down in the fall and stop at Izembek Lagoon. And there they fatten up for a long distance flight where they take off from Izembek and they fly nonstop across the Pacific Ocean, 3,000 miles down to coastal areas in Baja, Mexico. Another example that I can give, it's also an international crossroads to other places for other birds. The Izembek area also hosts and provides food for migrating shorebirds, for instance. And there's one shorebird that's been recently measured with new technology that shows that When it leaves Izembek, it flies nonstop across the Pacific Ocean to the Southern Hemisphere, all the way to New Zealand, 7,500 miles. It could never make that flight without the nutrients that it gets at Izembek. It's an incredibly special place, loaded with wildlife. Even though it's one of the smallest national wildlife refuge in Alaska, it's perhaps the most diverse and the most biologically productive of any of the wildlife refuges in the entire state. It's an incredibly special place. Going from here, I wanted to point out also that a little bit about the history of how it got established. And it fits into World War II history, when Japan attacked and occupied some of the Aleutian Islands. There was a soldier at the time who was stationed out in the Aleutian Islands during the war. His name was Bob Jones, and he later became known as Bob Sea Otter Jones. And after the war, he was able to, he became employed by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service as a manager of the Aleutian Islands National Wildlife Refuge. And he was stationed at Cold Bay, which is near Izembek Lagoon. And while he was there, he began to learn and see the connection between that lagoon, the eelgrass beds, and the value of Izembek. And so that ultimately led to establishment of the Izembek Refuge on December 6, 1960. And that was exactly the same date that the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge was established. And it's interesting that both of these special places were designated on the same day, and both of them have been fraught with long-standing, decades-long conflict over development, and that would destroy the integrity of these places. The area was studied for wilderness during the early 1970s and was ultimately designated wilderness in the Alaska National Interest Lands Conservation Act that passed in 1980. And it was soon after that some of the first proposals to build a road through the refuge came forward. And those proposals at that time were honest, in that it was stated that they wanted the road in order for economic purposes to ship fresh fish product from this big runway that's at Cold Bay that was created during World War II. Because the situation over at Cold Bay is that it's away from the mountains. The coastline of the Bering Sea is relatively flat and not mountainous, and it's reasonably easy for large aircraft to get in there, even during some pretty bad weather conditions, because there's no mountains nearby and much less turbulence for landing aircraft. Over at King Cove, where the let's see here, see if I can do this. Over at King Cove, where the big fish processing plant is in mountainous terrain. It's in a fjord-like area, and difficult during windy conditions to get planes in there, and especially a big plane to haul out huge loads of fresh fish. So from there, the proponents for the road finally discovered or felt that their economic justification was not going to be very viable in the political realm. And that's when Senator Ted Stevens, the late Senator Stevens from Alaska, who is also well known for pork barreling projects like the Bridges to Nowhere, got involved with the issue, and he developed legislation, introduced it in Congress, that would mandate a road through the Izembek Wilderness. And basically they would come out of King Cove, up and around this area here, and then up into some corporation lands that have now been transferred to the King Cove Corporation under the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act, and then ultimately pass through the wilderness onto this narrow isthmus that's full of wetlands and across through and get to Cold Bay where they could fly out the food or the fish. But at that time, the justification for the proposal was changed from commercial to emergency medical evacuations during stormy, inclement weather. And this area is famous for big storms. It's often called the cradle of the storms out in the Aleutian Islands and the tip of the Alaska Peninsula. And there are certainly conditions and times when you cannot fly out there. It's not possible because the storm is so terrible. The fact of the matter, however, is that Dr. Peter Moose, who was stationed with the Indian Health Service in King Cove and the Eastern Aleutians for like 3 decades, worked out there and dealt with medical evacuations. And he clearly states that to drive on a road under those conditions would be suicidal because of the blowing snow, black ice, avalanches along the mountainside near the coast, and not very feasible at all. But this argument of medical evacuation is being used to win people over in Congress and the administration, perhaps, to grant approval of the road. Well, when the Clinton administration began to take a look at this issue and respond to Stevens' legislation, they realized that this was a valuable wildlife refuge, a precious wilderness, and the precedent of allowing or passing legislation that would build a road in a wilderness was too big for them to approve. And eventually, President Clinton conveyed to Senator Stevens that if that bill passed, the president would veto it. Well, that brought everybody to the bargaining table at that point, and they negotiated a different approach. And that was the appropriation of $37.5 million for improvements to the King Cove Health Clinic, improvements to the King Cove runway, and to build a road out of King Cove up to a place called Leonard Harbor, where a hovercraft could be used for medical evacuations across Cold Bay, the Cold Bay area to get to the big runway to medevac people out. And that was implemented. A hovercraft was purchased for $9 million. The road was built, only the King Cove people didn't stop with the road at the harbor, at the place called Leonard Harbor. They built the road all the way to the border of the wilderness. And when Sally Jewell later went out there as Secretary of Interior to meet with them and to become familiar with the conflict in the situation, she asked them, why did you build the road beyond the hovercraft harbor right up to the wilderness boundary? And they told her, and she went on record explaining this, that they told her that they built the road all the way to the refuge to put pressure on her to approve the road. So that's the situation that we had through the end of the 1990s and all the way to 2010. Every time that the hovercraft was used for medical evacuation, there was at least 22 medical evacuations done with the hovercraft in varying weather. Every time it was used, it was successful, 100% success. However, the people that want that road for economic purposes have not rested on this, and they have resorted in the next decade to land exchange schemes. to try to exchange land so that the land would no longer be in wilderness, and then the road could be built. And so that's where I'll leave it off and pass this on to Dana to explain the next decade of struggles, especially with regards to land exchanges.
Thank you, Fran. And I'm just going to pull up my slides here. So hopefully these will cooperate. And hopefully everybody can see that okay. And if not, hopefully somebody will shoot me a chat message and let me know. So I will jump in here, and my plan is just to provide a really zoomed out view of what's happened since 2009. A lot has happened since then. And just to preface, I was not one of the litigating attorneys on the Izembek cases. We've been well represented by Trustees for Alaska in those cases, and our latest round of litigation is ongoing currently. But to understand how we got there and where we might be headed in the future, I'd like to step back to 2009 and talk about what happened. So in 2009, Congress passed the Omnibus Public Land Management Act. And in that, it directed the Department of Interior to prepare an environmental impact statement to determine whether a land exchange with King Cove would be in the public interest. And so the proposal at that time was to construct a road connecting King Cove with the Cold Bay Airport, which would require roughly a 12-mile road. That it might be a little bit difficult to see on that slide, but it's the red dotted line that would go right through the middle of the Izembek Wilderness. It would include 206 acres of land within Izembek in exchange for 56,000 acres of non-federal land outside of Izembek. And use of the road would be restricted primarily to health and safety purposes and only for non-commercial purposes. So Department of Interior prepared the environmental impact statement. And then in 2013, Secretary Jewell issued Interior's findings. And in that decision, Interior decided that the land exchange would not be in the public interest. They determined that there are reasonable and viable transportation alternatives, as Fran touched on, and that the ecological impacts of tearing a road right through the heart of the isthmus would be irreparable and significant. This is a big travel corridor for migratory caribou. It's got one of the highest densities of brown bears in the region. It's an incredibly important wetland habitat for waterfowl, and it's used a lot by marine mammal species. It's just an incredible ecological hub, and it's funneled through this narrow isthmus that the road would bisect directly. And so prior studies had called this particular road proposal the greatest known potential threat to wildlife and wilderness values within the Izembek complex. And in the 2013 decision, Jewell added that nothing is more contradictory with or destructive to the concept of wilderness than construction of a road. The impact of road construction on wilderness character would radiate far beyond the footprint of the road corridor. And these are concerns that we heard really consistently echoed over decades of analysis on this road proposal. So Alaska and King Cove were not pleased with Secretary Jewell's decision, and they challenged it in federal court. We, along with several other groups, intervened to defend that decision. And fortunately, the court upheld it. Alaska and King Cove appealed to the Ninth Circuit. But right at the 11th hour, after all of the briefing was done in the case, and right before oral argument, they pulled their appeal. And the reason for that became clear on January 22nd, 2018, when during one of the government shutdowns, the new secretary, Secretary Zinke, signed a closed door deal without any public notice and without any public opportunity to comment. Committing the federal government to a land exchange with King Cove to construct the road. So after decades of Department of Interior consistently finding that the road is not in the public interest, that it would frustrate wilderness and refuge purposes and severely and irreparably degrade the unique and critical ecosystems in Izembek, Trump administration comes into office and the Department of Interior drastically changes its position. So Zinke's agreement called for a land swap of 500 acres of land in Izembek for King Cove owned lands of equal value outside of the Izembek area. And this time, instead of banning commercial use of the road outright, it allowed commercial transport of fish and seafood products by individuals and small businesses. So after this agreement, we filed suit in federal district court, challenging the land exchange. And fortunately, in 2019, the court found Secretary Zinke's agreement unlawful. The judge found that Secretary Zinke provided no reasoned explanation for changing course on Interior's prior determinations. And in fact, he completely failed to acknowledge the prior determinations at all. So King Cove, Alaska, and this time Department of Interior all appealed to the Ninth Circuit. And then they once again pulled their appeal. So this time, cue Secretary Bernhardt, who decided to take a stab at a new agreement with King Cove. And the Bernhardt agreement was substantially similar to the Zinke agreement in that there was no public notice, there was no opportunity to comment. The land exchange involved lands within Izembek for King Cove owned lands outside of Izembek. But this time there was no provision limiting the use of the road for health and safety purposes, and there was no prohibition on commercial uses. And also unique to this agreement, Secretary Bernhardt, I'm assuming after the court opinion in the last round, accompanied this agreement with a memo where he explained that Interior was rebalancing the facts in light of a new focus on the social and economic needs of King Cove. So same facts and different weight being applied to them. So we sued again. And fortunately, once again in 2020, the court found the Bernhardt agreement to be unlawful as well. And the judge noted in that case that Secretary Bernhardt had still offered no reasoned explanation for reversing course on this long history of Interior determinations. And importantly, in this round of litigation and relevant to what's going on now, the court also dove into ANILCA and what that statute allows as far as development of transportation systems through conservation units in Alaska. And in this case, Interior had improperly used section 1302H of ANILCA, which allows for land acquisition to further the purposes of the statute. And ANILCA has two purposes. The first is ecological preservation, which this land exchange was clearly not catered toward. And the second is subsistence, which the court found was not presented as a purpose, and nor did the record support it as one. So in any event, the court held that road development is something different, and it falls under a different section of ANILCA altogether. And so the court held that Title 11 provides the single statutory, comprehensive statutory authority for the approval of transportation systems within conservation areas such as Izembek. And this is really important because Title 11 of ANILCA has really strict agency and public process requirements, and it requires really exacting factual findings before a transportation system can be approved through a conservation area. And if one is proposed within a wilderness that is within a conservation area, it requires approval by the president and by Congress. So much higher hurdles to overcome if you are following the processes under Title 11 of ANILCA. So the court landed where we wanted in that round, but once again, King Cove, State of Alaska, and Department of Interior appealed to the Ninth Circuit. And currently that appeal is pending, it's still ongoing, but the story doesn't quite end there. In addition to appealing, Alaska and King Cove last fall tried a new angle. Back in October, They filed a right-of-way application with the Fish and Wildlife Service under a different section of ANILCA. That section provides a right of access to inholdings, which the statute defines as state or privately owned lands within or effectively surrounded by conservation system units. And along with that right-of-way application, they also filed for a special use permit to go into the Izembek area and conduct wetland, cultural resource, and geotechnical surveys. And they'd like to use helicopters and ATVs to do that. And they're in there gathering information to support their right-of-way application. So the regional staff of the Fish and Wildlife Service in December of 2020 take a look at this application. They see that it's incomplete and they send a letter to Alaska and King Cove requesting fairly significant additional information from them. But on January 15th, as one of the last gestures before leaving office, Secretary Bernhardt issued a memo overriding the Fish and Wildlife Service's regional staff and deeming the application complete. And the memo also directed the Fish and Wildlife Service to quickly approve the application. So that same day, on January 15th, the Fish and Wildlife Service rescinded their December 20th letter. So a lot of moving parts. And where we are now is, unfortunately, the Biden administration has not yet stepped up to the plate to reverse the Trump administration's actions. The appeal is still ongoing. They are still considering the right-of-way and special use permit applications. The applications have indicated that the survey work will happen this summer. So we're expecting some on-the-ground activity soon, assuming those permits are granted. And we are working with a coalition of groups right now to figure out how to best challenge the right-of-way application. But the bottom line, tracing back the history from 2009 and then the decades prior, it's clear that the state of Alaska and King Cove are doing everything they can to push this road through. And Izembek is very much at risk, and it continues to be very much at risk, even with the new administration in office. And it will likely take a lot of pressure from a lot of different angles to keep it safe. And so you can expect some calls to action from us in the coming months, explaining how you can help us do that. And I think I will hand the mic back to George to let him talk a little bit more about that and wrap things up, and we'll take some questions from people after George is done. Thanks.
Well, thank you, Dana and Fran. Excellent presentations, a lot of information there, but a lot of really useful information. One of the things that you touched on, Fran, was the assessments that were done to determine that there were better alternatives than building a road to get between King Cove and Cold Bay. And I know that when Secretary Jewell issued her decision in 2013, there was also a request that the Corps of Engineers do an analysis of alternative ways to achieve the goals. And can you explain a little bit about what the outcome of that was?
Sure. Yeah, it was a very credible analysis that the Corps of Engineers did. Let's see, yeah, I guess everybody can hear me. And they looked at the marine transport system leaving from Leonard Harbor north of King Cove, and I think they had an alternative also from King Cove directly, and a third one from a dock facility up near the refuge border that would go directly across to Cold Bay. And they also evaluated various scenarios using Coast Guard or other instrument-equipped helicopters to medical evac people over to the big runway. And And they also looked into an alternative of building a new runway farther to the northeast from King Cove that may have better capability for landing airplanes in inclement weather. That option did not come out very well. The helicopter option was not, had a number of technical issues with it. However, the marine transport method, which basically was what was tried to implement with the hovercraft until King Cove transferred the hovercraft away, saying it was too expensive, and they finally sold it. At any rate, the marine transport system, using a significant vessel, either of the capability of a Bering Sea crab boat or a marine ferry boat that can negotiate 12 inches of ice and very high seas to go across during a terrible storm to get to Cold Bay. And it also looked at improving the Cold Bay dock and breakwater that would be necessary for a evacuation ferry to land there. Now, this option would also solve the problem regarding the economic issue, because it would probably be cheaper to move large amounts of fish product on a vessel if they could land at Cold Bay. The issue at Cold Bay is that it's a military airstrip, not a fishing harbor. And so it needs a breakwater, and the current dock they have there is unworkable currently. And if those things were built, the marine option would work well. And the Corps of Engineers, in their analysis, they found that a marine transport system would be reliable 99% of the time. And they looked at the frequency of storms and the various parameters and difficulty of storms. 99% of the time would be reliable. And quite honestly, I think that's a good, solid alternative for avoiding and should be followed rather than the road.
Okay, well, thank you. Maybe that's something that Biden can spend his infrastructure money on to protect Izembek.
I think it would be a wise investment. It would reinforce his policy on 30 by 30 to keep these wild places intact for biodiversity and climate change issues that we're facing.
Right. So I have a question, and I don't know, perhaps this is for you as well, Fran. What's the anticipated impact of global climate change, particularly expected sea rise, in the future of the Izembek Refuge?
I'm not sure I can answer that in a credible way. It's not something that I've looked into, quite frankly. As we know, we've got climate change going on, and sea level rises are predicted. It remains to be seen just how some of these things develop. Very unpredictable. I guess that's the main point I would make, is that we're surprised every so often with climate change that things are happening faster, more dramatic than what we'd anticipated. A lot of the scientists that predicted many of the climate change things we've found that their predictions were inadequate to deal with what's actually starting to happen. I know I'm not able to answer the question in a credible manner specific to Izembek Lagoon. The only comment I would make is that by maintaining Izembek Lagoon and protecting the watershed that leads into it by not building a road there, eelgrass has been found to be a great carbon sink. It's one of the best carbon sinks in the environment. And the last thing we'd want to do is damage that. But certainly it's possible that higher water levels and changes in oceanographic conditions could change Izembek Lagoon. We just don't know.
All right. Thank you, Fran. We have another question here, and I think you touched on this, Dana, but it's asking whether the Biden administration has said anything at all about the road and Izembek.
Yeah, well, at least from the litigation perspective, they have requested a couple of stays in the case to take a closer look at this issue with the change in administration and getting a new secretary in place. And so they've kind of, hit a pause button on things for several months while they're reviewing, the Izembek and a multitude of other actions. And so they have not come out, to my knowledge, very publicly on this issue yet. They've kind of been in a holding pattern, and I think are going to make their move later. But as I mentioned, there's a couple of permit applications pending that I'm sure are putting some time pressures on the administration. The litigation is pending. And so I would imagine we will be hearing more from them very soon on this, but I don't know, maybe Fran or George, I don't know if you have more information on that.
Yeah, I'd like to add a couple of further dimensions to it. One is that certainly Senator Murkowski is pressuring the secretary, is pressuring the Fish and Wildlife Service to get those permit requests from the state of Alaska for a right-of-way pre-construction studies for the right-of-way. And so they're under a lot of pressure right now. And I don't know, something could happen that doesn't bode well for the future of this place. I can't predict it for sure. There's another point I wanted to make, and it's escaping me at the moment, but
Well,
I'll bring it up if
yeah, we can come back to it. And I would only add, and it's really just observation primarily, but it's not a secret that there were a lot of discussions between the Biden administration and Senator Murkowski in particular, but other members of the Alaska delegation prior to Secretary Holland being approved. And ultimately, both Alaska senators voted for her, and Congressman Don Young from Alaska actually introduced her at her Senate hearing and endorsed her. So there's a lot of concern, let's say, that there's potentially some quid pro quo going on. We've seen some really good decisions involving Alaska, things like the Tongass roadless rule, the pause on the leasing, in the any work on the leases that were issued by the Trump administration in the Arctic Refuge and other things. But we've also seen some approvals moving forward on oil and gas development elsewhere. And because we don't know where the administration is ultimately going to come down on Izembek, it's an issue that that we just feel is it's high risk right now, and it's just one of those where you just can't take your foot off the pedal, because we could ultimately lose Izembek to something else. One of the other things that often happens, and this is how we got stuck in this mess in 2009, is Congress at the end of the session likes to put together these big omnibus bills, and they like to throw in a few, bill, everybody gets to throw their bill into the hopper in order to get everybody to vote for it. And as Senator Murkowski did in 2009, when she threw in the Izembek road into that legislation, that could very well happen again if we see a big public lands omnibus bill. And it will take a lot of public pressure to force, in this case, the Democrats to keep that kind of a provision out of such an omnibus bill. So it's going to be a long slog, I'm afraid. And we don't know what's going to happen with the case in the Ninth Circuit either. You know, that thing is still going forward, and we'll have to see what the results of that are.
Yeah, the point that I was intending to make also was that during Secretary Holland's confirmation hearing, Senator Murkowski extracted a commitment from Deb Haaland that she would visit King Cove before they did anything drastic one way or the other. And so that is until, and it's until she's likely, I don't know when she'll go out to King Cove, but it's likely it might happen possibly in August. That's a typical time when VIP type officials make trips to Alaska. And so what's in between all this is the granting of these special use permits. Are they going to grant the permits before she goes out to King Cove, or are they going to hold them until she makes her trip? So there's a lot of uncertainty going on, and I agree with the other things that George said, of course, with omnibus bills and politics on the Hill, compromises. That's where bad things happen many times, at least from our perspective.
Right. So we have a couple of questions here that are related, really, I guess, along in the political sphere on this proposal. One of them is, do we know what the position of West Coast senators outside of Alaska it is on the Izembek Road? And that would be, you know, the senators from Washington, Oregon, and California. And a related question about whether there are any Alaska state politicians who oppose the road. Do you guys have any thoughts about that?
I'm not aware of any Alaska state politicians that are against the road. I may be wrong about this, but in the past, people from Yukon Delta, their leaders out there, voiced strong opposition to the road because it has implications for threatening the population of Pacific brant. And they hunt those brant when they come up to the Yukon Delta Refuge for nesting and after the nesting season. And the people out in the Yukon Delta have worked for a long time to try to rebuild some of the goose populations from declines in the past. And they've gone on record back during the days in the Clinton administration when Ted Stevens was pushing the road through legislation. They came out strongly opposed to the road. And it remains to be seen just where they're at nowadays on that issue. But certainly, the governor of Alaska is on board with supporting the road.
It seems like one of those like drilling in the Arctic refuge where every Alaska politician has to come out in favor. But speaking of alternatives, Fran, one question was raised, whether there's been any consideration of just moving the cannery over to Cold Bay and putting an end to this whole discussion. Have you ever heard any discussion of that?
No, that's a new one for me, but maybe we should look into that. And
That's why we have these webinars, so that we can get good ideas from people.
Well, I humbly admit that we don't have all the answers to everything on this. And there's new ideas out there we should leave no stone unturned in protecting this wilderness is about what it amounts to. So welcome anybody's ideas about how to solve this problem.
Okay, and one question, Dana, that for you perhaps is whether or not the Clean Water Act, and I'm not, as applied in defense of Bristol Bay, might be useful in something like fighting a road through Izembek.
Yeah, has not been a focal point of the litigation to date. So far, the litigation has been primarily focused on ANILCA and its provisions and the Administrative Procedure Act, which is the statute that is involved in the agency changing their position over time and not providing a reasoned explanation for why they're doing that. And so far, those two have kind of been the front runners in stopping this project over and over again. But I have not personally looked into whether the Clean Water Act would be a resource on this going forward. And I haven't heard conversation about that at this point, but that doesn't mean it wouldn't. So
I might be able to shed some light on that. There was a wetlands investigation that the Corps of Engineers did for the road area, separate from this other alternative transport analysis they did. And in that analysis, they found that there's a provision in the Clean Water Act that the Corps determined that particular provision, which regards directs that wetlands not be damaged if there's a reasonable alternative, and the Corps made the call that there's a reasonable alternative to the road, and that the wetlands, they could not authorize a wetlands permit for the road because there's a reasonable alternative. And I can track down that Corps of Engineers report that has that in it. You know, I'll share it with everybody, or we can put it on our web for that matter.
So it's probably safe to assume at some point that could come into play.
And George, let me just add a little bit to that too. I mean, even with the current right-of-way application, the provision of ANILCA that has been requested under has a similar caveat to it, that those right-of-ways won't be granted if there is another mode of access that's, I'm not sure exactly what the language is, but reasonable or feasible. Mm-hmm. And so I think that inquiry is one that we will see under quite a few statutory schemes when we're talking about Izembek.
Okay, since we're drawing near the end of our hour, and I do want to talk a little bit about what folks can do, but I wonder, Fran and Dana, if you have anything you want to quickly add before we conclude this webinar.
I would just add that I appreciate everybody who got on this webinar to show interest in this issue. I really appreciate their participation. Otherwise, I don't have any other things to say, I guess, at this point.
I would just reiterate how important this little stretch of land is We've written a lot about it. You can find it on our website if you want to learn a little bit more about this area and the ecology and its importance to wildlife. I would reiterate, George, your opening message about watching the full video that we started with that has a lot of great information. But this really is an incredibly sensitive and spectacular area that has been under fire for a very long time. So the more people know about it, the more engaged they get, the better chance we have in keeping it intact.
Okay, well, thank you. And I too want to say thank you so much to all of you out there who registered for and have been watching this webinar. It's such an important issue. It's such an important place. It's a place that, frankly, even before that, when this, it was a place rarely heard of. Well, it's rarely heard of now, and it was even more rarely heard of prior to this road. It's not something that a lot of people know. And so it's one where everybody who cares needs to stay active, needs to be involved. And as Fran has described and as the video described, it's certainly a place worthy of protection. Now, all of you will be receiving a follow-up email from us with a link to the video, to the full video, so you can go there to watch that. There will be a link to this webinar recording if there was something here that you want to go back and hear again. And then some additional information and articles that we think you'll find interesting. And what I would say as far as what we can do is, Wilderness Watch for information and alerts that we'll be sending out consistently about Izembek and what people can do to take action. I think one of the first things we'll probably be asking people for help on is this special use permit that was talked about, where they want to use helicopters and all-terrain vehicles to go out and do a survey through the Izembek Wilderness for where this road will go. And so that will be an important opportunity. It's never too early or too late to write to your members of Congress and your senators and tell them that you want them to protect Izembek, or to write to the Secretary of Interior. And we'll be sending out more of this kind of information to all of you. So you'll have addresses and all of those kinds of things, so that you can reach out to the decision makers and let them know how you feel. With that, I just again want to say thank you to Dana and to Fran and to Dawn for all your good work in making this happen. And again, to all of you for tuning in, and hope to see you next time. So thank you.
Thank you.